The candles flickered against stone walls that had witnessed too many secrets, their amber light casting shadows that danced like whispers across her pale skin. She stood at the center of the great hall, trembling not from cold but from the weight of 100 cruel gazes that measured her worth in coins and laughter. The scent of wine and dying roses hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic taste of her own fear. Behind her, the voices of those who had brought her here faded into a distant hum, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat and the approaching footsteps of the man they called the Raven Lord. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The letter had arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the windows like forgotten prayers. Serafina had been scrubbing the kitchen stones when the messenger's horse thundered into the courtyard, its breath forming clouds in the bitter air. She had not been told what the parchment contained, only that she was to pack her few belongings and prepare for a journey. The other servants whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes bright with malicious curiosity. They knew, as she did not, that she was being sent away like damaged goods, an unwanted burden finally lifted from shoulders that had grown tired of carrying her. Her guardian, a distant cousin who had inherited her along with the crumbling estate, stood in the doorway as she gathered her things. His face bore the expression of a man disposing of something unpleasant but necessary. "You will serve in the household of Lord Damien Ashworth," he said, his voice flat as winter stone. "Consider yourself fortunate. Few would take someone of your circumstances." The word hung between them like a blade. Circumstances. The polite term for being born to a mother who had died in shame and a father who had never claimed her name. The journey north took 3 days through landscapes that grew progressively darker, as if the very earth absorbed light rather than reflected it. The carriage wheels creaked over roads that seemed to lead away from the world she knew into something older, more primitive. Ancient trees pressed close to the path, their branches intertwining overhead like fingers clasped in prayer or warning. Serafina pressed her face to the small window, watching the familiar give way to the unknown, feeling each mile stretch the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. The castle emerged from the mist like a creature rising from deep water. Black stone towers pierced the gray sky, their windows dark as closed eyes. Ivy crawled up the walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the building itself were slowly being consumed by the wild. The air here tasted different, sharper, electric with the promise of storms. As the carriage rolled through the massive gates, Serafina felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she could not name. The household staff who greeted her were silent as shadows, their movements efficient and respectful but distant. They led her through corridors lined with portraits whose subjects seemed to watch her passage with knowing eyes. The walls themselves appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting with each gust of wind that found its way through the ancient stones. Her chamber was small but clean, with a single window that looked out over gardens where roses bloomed black in the fading light. That first evening, she was summoned to dinner. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral of hunger and judgment. Long tables filled with lords and ladies in rich fabrics that caught the firelight and threw it back in jeweled fragments. She entered wearing her one good dress, a simple gray thing that marked her immediately as an outsider, a servant among those who commanded. The conversations quieted as she passed, not stopping entirely, but lowering to the volume of secrets. At the head table sat Lord Damien Ashworth, and Serafina understood immediately why the servants spoke his name in whispers. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, sharp edges and dark depths that promise both pleasure and destruction. His hair was black as the wings of the ravens that nested in the castle towers, and his eyes held the pale intensity of winter storms. When he looked at her, she felt as though he could see not just her face but the thoughts behind it, the fears and hopes she kept buried beneath layers of practiced invisibility. The meal proceeded in waves of tension and release. She sat at the far end of the servants' table, trying to make herself small while the nobility laughed and drank around her. But she could feel his gaze returning to her throughout the evening, a weight that settled on her shoulders like a cloak. When he finally spoke to her, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are the one they sent to manage my correspondence," he said. It was not a question but a statement that required confirmation. Serafina nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Can you read Latin?" Again she nodded. "Greek?" This time she hesitated before responding affirmatively. Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "We will begin tomorrow at dawn. Do not be late." The other servants showed her to a small chamber adjacent to the library where she would work. The room smelled of old parchment and dried ink, comforting scents that reminded her of the few happy hours of her childhood spent hidden away with stolen books. As she prepared for sleep, she could hear the wind howling around the castle walls, carrying with it sounds that might have been voices or might have been imagination. Dawn came gray and cold, filtering through windows thick with centuries of weather. Serafina made her way to the library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books that seemed to contain all the knowledge of the world. Lord Ashworth was already there, standing beside a massive desk covered with papers and scrolls. In the morning light, he appeared less otherworldly, but no less commanding. His presence filled the space like smoke, making the air itself seem denser. "You will translate these," he said, gesturing to a pile of documents written in languages she recognized and some she did not. Latin to English, Greek to Latin, some correspondence in French that requires delicate handling. His fingers, long and pale, traced the edge of a particularly ancient-looking manuscript. Some of these contained sensitive information. "You will speak of them to no one." For hours she worked in silence, the scratch of her quill the only sound in the vast room. The documents revealed glimpses of a world far more complex than she had imagined, trade agreements with distant kingdoms, diplomatic correspondence that hinted at alliances and betrayals, scientific treatises on subjects that bordered on the mystical. Lord Ashworth moved around the library like a shadow, sometimes reading over her shoulder, sometimes disappearing entirely into the maze of shelves. When the sun reached its zenith, he brought her food himself. Not a servant's meal of bread and thin soup, but rich stew and fresh bread, wine that tasted of summer despite the winter cold outside. She ate in grateful silence while he watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. "You write well," he said finally. "Better than the last 3 scholars I employed." There was something in his voice she could not identify, a note that made her look up from her work to meet his eyes directly for the first time. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Dawn in the library, hours lost in the careful translation of words that carried the weight of kingdoms. Lord Ashworth proved to be an unexpected teacher, explaining context when she struggled with archaic phrases, sharing knowledge that no tutor had ever offered her. He spoke of languages as living things, of how words could carry power beyond their simple meanings, of how a single mistranslation could topple governments or start wars. But it was in the evenings that she began to understand the true nature of the castle and its master. As darkness fell, the building transformed. Sounds echoed through corridors that had been silent during the day, footsteps with no visible source, voices speaking in languages older than any she had studied. The servants moved differently after sunset, with a purpose that seemed almost ritualistic. And Lord Ashworth himself changed, becoming more intense, more present, as if the night called to something fundamental in his nature. She began to notice other things as well. The way shadows seemed to bend toward him when he passed. The fact that mirrors reflected his image strangely, as if a silver could not quite capture his true form. The servants who had served his family for generations spoke of him with a reverence that went beyond mere respect for nobility. They called him my lord, but their eyes held the devotion usually reserved for deities or demons. One evening, as autumn deepened into the promise of winter, she was working late in the library when she heard music drifting from somewhere deeper in the castle. A violin played a melody so achingly beautiful that it seemed to pull at something inside her chest. Without conscious decision, she found herself following the sound through corridors she had never explored, past tapestries that depicted scenes of hunts where the prey appeared almost human, through doorways that opened onto rooms filled with objects she could not immediately identify. The music led her to a chamber at the heart of the castle, where Lord Ashworth stood silhouetted against a massive fireplace. The violin tucked beneath his chin seemed to be an extension of his body, the bow moving across the strings with fluid grace. His eyes were closed, his face transformed by an expression of such profound longing that Serafina felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred and private. She turned to leave, but her movement caused a floorboard to creak. The music stopped abruptly, and his eyes opened to find her standing in the doorway. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other. The fire cast dancing shadows across his features, making him appear both more human and less so. "I apologize," she whispered. "I heard the music end." "Do not apologize for beauty drawing you forward," he said, lowering the violin. "It is what beauty is meant to do." He moved closer, and she caught a scent that reminded her of winter forests and something darker, more primal. "Did you enjoy it?" "It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she replied honestly. The admission hung between them like a bridge she had not meant to build. "Music is the only honest language," he said. "Words can lie, actions can deceive, but music reveals the truth of what lives inside us." He set the violin carefully in its case, his movements precise and reverent. "What truth does music reveal about you, Serafina?" The use of her name, spoken in his deep voice, sent something warm spiraling through her chest. She realized he had never used it before, had always addressed her formally or not at all. "I do not know," she said. "I have never had the opportunity to find out." "Then we shall discover it together," he replied. The lessons began the next evening. After their work in the library concluded, he would lead her to the music room where a smaller violin waited. His hands guided hers to the proper positions, his voice patient as he explained techniques that had been passed down through generations of masters. At first, the sounds she produced were more noise than music, scratching protests from strings that seemed determined to resist her efforts. But gradually, as the nights passed, something began to emerge. Not skill, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. She learned to feel the music before she played it, to let her emotions flow through her fingers into the strings. Lord Ashworth proved to be a demanding but encouraging teacher, pushing her past comfort into territories where her natural timidity could not follow. "Do not think so much," he would say when she struggled with a particularly difficult passage. "Let your heart speak directly to the instrument. Trust that the music knows what it wants to become." During these lessons, she began to see aspects of him that the formal distance of their daily work had hidden. The way his face softened when she managed to coax beauty from the violin. How he would sometimes close his eyes and smile when she played, as if her fumbling attempts carried him to places of memory or dream. The careful way he corrected her posture, his hands professional but gentle, leaving warmth wherever they touched. It was during one of these lessons that the first letter arrived. She was practicing a simple melody when the sound of hooves, thundering across the courtyard, interrupted the music. Through the window, she could see torches approaching through the darkness, too many for a casual visit. Lord Ashworth's expression changed instantly, becoming closed and alert. "Continue practicing," he told her. "Do not leave this room until I return." But curiosity proved stronger than obedience. After waiting what seemed like hours, she crept through the corridors toward the great hall, where voices carried on the night air. Hidden behind a tapestry, she listened as Lord Ashworth spoke with men whose voices carried the authority of those accustomed to being feared. They spoke of territories and boundaries, of old agreements and new threats. One voice, rougher than the others, mentioned her name. "The girl," the stranger said. "She is not what we expected." "Expectations," Lord Ashworth replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "are rarely accurate when applied to matters of significance." "The arrangement was specific," another voice interjected. "A servant, nothing more. Someone to handle correspondence while remaining invisible. Instead, we hear reports of music lessons, of private conversations. This was not the agreement. Agreements," Lord Ashworth said slowly, "can evolve when circumstances prove more complex than originally anticipated." The conversation continued, but Serafina found herself unable to focus on the words. The realization that her presence here had been the subject of some formal arrangement, that she was not simply a servant but part of something larger and more complicated, sent cold fingers of fear trailing down her spine. She crept back to her chamber, but sleep proved elusive as questions circled in her mind like carrion birds. The next morning, Lord Ashworth was distant during their work session. He spoke only when necessary, his attention focused entirely on the documents before him. When she asked about a particularly difficult translation, his response was curt, professional. The warmth that had been growing between them seemed to have frozen overnight, leaving only the formal relationship of master and servant. This continued for several days. No music lessons, no shared meals, no moments of connection that had begun to feel as natural as breathing. Serafina threw herself into her work, translating with mechanical precision while her heart grew heavier with each passing hour. She began to understand that whatever forces had brought her to this place were far more complex than a simple need for clerical assistance. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, who finally provided some illumination. An older woman, who moved through the castle like a ship navigating familiar waters, she appeared in Serafina's chamber one evening carrying tea and wearing an expression of maternal concern. "You have questions," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "I can see them eating at you like moths in wool." "I do not understand my place here," Serafina admitted. "I was told I was to be a servant, but servants do not usually receive private music lessons from the master of the house," Mrs. Blackwood finished. "Nor do they dine on food from the Lord's own table." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "The truth, child, is that your arrival here was part of an arrangement made long before you were born. Old debts, older promises, the kind of agreements that bind families across generations." "What kind of arrangement?" Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for so long that Serafina began to think she would not answer. Finally, she spoke. "Your mother, before she died, made a bargain. Protection for her child in exchange for service when the time came. Lord Ashworth's father honored that agreement when he took you into his household as an infant. Now that debt has passed to his son. But why bring me here? Why now? Because, child, there are forces in this world that operate according to laws older than governments or churches. Lord Ashworth is not merely a nobleman. He is a guardian, a keeper of balances that most people never know exist. And you—" She paused, studying Serafina's face. "You are not simply a debtor's daughter. You carry something in your blood that makes you valuable to both sides of a very old conflict." Before Serafina could ask what she meant, Mrs. Blackwood stood to leave. At the door, she turned back with a look of genuine affection. "Be careful, dear one. The game you have entered is far more dangerous than you know. But remember this, Lord Ashworth may be bound by ancient obligations, but what I see in his eyes when he looks at you has nothing to do with duty." That night, Serafina lay awake staring at the ceiling while wind howled around the castle walls. The revelation that her entire life had been shaped by agreements made before her birth should have filled her with anger or despair. Instead, she found herself thinking about Lord Ashworth's hands guiding hers on the violin strings, about the way his voice softened when he explained difficult concepts, about the longing in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The next morning brought another messenger, this one arriving in daylight with less drama but carrying news that proved far more devastating. Serafina was in the library when she heard Lord Ashworth's sharp intake of breath as he read the letter. His face went pale, then flushed with what could only be described as rage. "Pack your things," he said without looking at her. "You leave tonight." The words hit her like physical blows. "My lord, if I have done something wrong—" "You have done nothing wrong," he interrupted, his voice tight with control. "But circumstances have changed. The arrangement that brought you here has been modified." "Modified how?" He finally looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not anger she saw there, but fear. "You are to be married," he said simply, "to a man who will provide you with a title and protection. The ceremony has been arranged for next month." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Married? To whom? Lord Garrett Thornfield, a man of good family and substantial holdings. His voice was carefully neutral, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You will be well provided for." I was not consulted about this decision. Consultation was not required. The formal distance had returned to his voice, but she could see the strain it cost him. "You are not a free agent, Serafina. You never have been. The sooner you accept this, the easier your life will become." She stood slowly, feeling as though the floor might give way beneath her feet. "And if I refuse?" "Refusal is not an option." That evening, she was indeed packed and ready to leave, but not in the way Lord Ashworth had commanded. Instead of loading her few possessions into a carriage bound for her arranged marriage, She had made a different choice. As darkness fell and the castle settled into its nocturnal rhythms, she made her way through corridors she had memorized during her weeks of residence, past sleeping servants and flickering torches, to the music room where her violin waited. She played softly, careful not to wake the household, letting the melody carry all the words she could not speak. The music wove together gratitude and sorrow, acceptance and rebellion, love acknowledged but unexpressed. When the last note faded into silence, she was not surprised to find Lord Ashworth standing in the doorway. "You should not be here," he said, but he made no move to send her away. "Neither should you," she replied. He entered the room and closed the door behind him, leaning against it as if barring the way for forces that might try to separate them. In the firelight, he looked like a man wrestling with demons, visible only to him. "Seraphina," he said, her name carrying weights she was only beginning to understand. "There are things about this world, about me, that you do not know." "Then tell me. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, and some silences are more dangerous than any truth." He crossed the room to stand before the fire, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "My family has guarded certain boundaries far longer than recorded history. We are bound by oaths older than nations, charged with maintaining balances between forces that would consume this world if left unchecked. I am not entirely human, Seraphina. I am something older, something that exists in the spaces between what people believe possible and what they fear might be true." She absorbed this revelation with surprising calm. Perhaps her weeks in the castle had prepared her for such impossibilities, or perhaps her heart had already known what her mind was only now accepting. "What are you?" she asked quietly. "I am what your people call vampire, though the reality is far more complex than the stories suggest. I do not hunt innocence or drain the blood of the unwilling. But I am bound to this existence by forces beyond my control, cursed to watch ages pass while I remain unchanged." He turned to face her then, and in his eyes she saw the accumulation of lonely years stretching back through centuries. "The arrangement that brought you here was not simply about clerical work. Your bloodline carries certain properties that make you valuable as an anchor, a connection to humanity that could provide stability to creatures like myself." "An anchor," she repeated, "a bond that would allow me to experience human emotions more completely, to connect with the world of the living rather than existing perpetually on its edges. But such a bond, once formed, is not easily broken. It would change you as well, mark you as belonging to something outside normal human experience." The implications of his words settled around her like snowfall. "And Lord Thornfield represents the faction that believes such bonds are too dangerous to permit. By arranging your marriage to him, they remove you from my sphere while ensuring that your bloodline serves their purposes instead of mine." His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I am bound by ancient laws not to interfere with their decision. But you are telling me this now, because you deserve to understand what choice you are really making. If you leave tomorrow, you will live a normal human life with a man who will provide for you adequately but will never understand the depths you carry inside you. If you stay—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "If you stay, you enter a world of wonders and terrors, bound to a creature who has watched empires rise and fall, who can offer you centuries of existence, but never the simple human happiness you deserve." Seraphina moved to the window, looking out over gardens where moonlight painted the black roses silver. The choice he presented was impossible and inevitable, terrifying and exhilarating. She thought of her years of servitude, of being unwanted and unremarkable, of accepting whatever life others chose to give her. Then she thought of the music lessons, of feeling truly seen for the first time in her existence, of a love that transcended the boundaries of normal human experience. "What would this bond entail?" she asked. "A ceremony older than Christianity, a joining that would link our essences across the barriers between mortal and immortal. You would retain your humanity, but gain access to abilities and perceptions beyond normal human reach. You would live as long as I do, experience the world as I do, but remain yourself in all the ways that matter. And if I chose that path, then we would face together whatever consequences arise from defying arrangements made by those more powerful than either of us." She turned from the window to find him watching her with an expression of such vulnerable hope that her heart constricted. This creature who commanded storms and shadows, who carried the authority of centuries, was waiting for her decision with the uncertainty of a young man facing his first rejection. "Damien," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to release something that had been held tightly controlled between them. "I have spent my entire life being what others required me to be. A burden to be endured, a problem to be solved, a pawn to be moved across boards designed by other players. For the first time, you are offering me a choice that is truly mine to make. Then what do you choose?" Instead of answering with words, she moved to where her violin lay waiting. She picked up the bow and began to play, not the simple exercises he had taught her, but a melody that seemed to emerge from some deep place inside her heart. The music filled the room with cascades of sound that spoke of acceptance and defiance, of love acknowledged and embraced despite all obstacles. When the song ended, she set down the violin and moved to stand before him. "I choose you," she said simply. "I choose the wonders and the terrors, the centuries of existence, the bond that will mark me as belonging to something outside normal human experience. I choose a love that transcends the boundaries between mortal and immortal." The transformation in his expression was like watching sunrise break over mountains. Hope bloomed across his features, followed immediately by concern. "Serafina, the risks are mine to take," she interrupted, "as is the choice." He reached for her then, his hands framing her face with reverent care. "The ceremony must be performed before dawn, before those who would prevent it can intervene. Once begun, it cannot be stopped or reversed. Then let us begin." The ritual took place in a chamber deep beneath the castle, in rooms carved from living rock that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Ancient symbols covered the walls, their meanings lost to all but a few who still remembered the old ways. Candles burned with flames that cast no shadows, and the air itself seemed thick with power barely contained. Lord Ashworth had changed into robes that appeared to be woven from darkness itself, while Serafina wore a gown of white silk that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The contrast between them was stark and beautiful, mortality and immortality preparing to join in ways that defied natural law. The words he spoke were in a language older than Latin, syllables that seemed to resonate in her bones rather than her ears. With each phrase, she felt something shifting inside her, barriers dissolving that she had not known existed. When he drew a blade across his palm and offered her the wound to drink from, she did not hesitate. The taste was not what she had expected, not metallic or unpleasant, but warm and complex, carrying flavors of starlight and centuries. In return, she offered her own blood, watching as he drank with reverent care. The moment their mingled essence joined, the world exploded into sensation beyond anything she had ever imagined. She could feel his heartbeat as if it were her own, could sense the vast accumulation of his memories stretching back through ages, could perceive the network of life and death that connected all things. But most overwhelming was the love that flowed between them, no longer hidden or restrained but burning bright as the stars themselves. She understood now why such bonds were feared by those who sought to control the supernatural world. This was power that could not be commanded or contained, love that recognized no authority beyond itself. When the ceremony concluded, dawn was breaking over the castle walls. But the light that streamed through the chamber's windows seemed different now, richer and more complex, carrying information her newly awakened senses could decode. She could hear the conversations of birds in distant trees, could smell the approaching rain still hours away, could feel the subtle vibrations that indicated someone moving through the castle far above them. "They are coming," Damien said, his voice tight with tension. "Word of what we have done has already reached those who arranged your marriage. We have perhaps an hour before they arrive with enough force to challenge even my authority." "Then we leave," she said, surprised by the calm certainty in her own voice. "Leave?" "Serafina, this castle has been my family's seat for 8 centuries. These lands, these people, I am bound to protect them. And now you are bound to me as well." She moved to the window, looking out over territories that seemed more vivid and alive than they had just hours before. "We can return when the immediate danger has passed, when we have had time to consolidate what we have gained. But staying now would mean losing everything we have just claimed." He was quiet for long moments, wrestling with obligations that pulled in different directions. Finally, he nodded. There are safe houses, hidden places where we can remain until the political situation stabilizes. But once we leave, there will be no returning to the life you knew. The life I knew, she said, turning to face him, ended the moment I walked into this castle. Everything, since then, has been preparation for this moment. They fled as the sun climbed higher, taking only what could be carried quickly, through passages known only to the castle's oldest residents, past crypts where Damien's ancestors lay sleeping, into tunnels that connected to caves in the hillsides beyond. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, but ahead lay freedom and the promise of a love that had already proven itself stronger than ancient laws or political arrangements. As they emerged into daylight filtered through forest canopy, Serafina felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away like a discarded skin. The timid servant girl who had arrived at the castle weeks ago no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had chosen her own destiny, who had embraced a love that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal, who had claimed power over her own existence for the first time in her life. The future stretched before them uncertain, but full of possibility. There would be challenges to face, enemies to evade, a new reality to navigate. But they would face it together, bound by choices freely made and love freely given. And in the distance behind them, the castle bells began to toll, not in mourning for what was lost, but in celebration of what had been found. The sound followed them into the forest, a benediction, and a promise that some endings are really beginnings in disguise. Years passed like pages turning in a book written in languages only they could read. They moved through the world as shadows within shadows, appearing when they chose to be seen, vanishing when discovery threatened. The bond between them had grown deeper with each passing season, allowing them to communicate without words, to share experiences across the barriers that normally separated individual consciousness. Serafina learned to navigate the complexities of her new existence with grace that surprised even Damien. The abilities that came with their bond, enhanced senses, extended lifespan, access to knowledge accumulated across centuries, she wielded with natural skill. But more importantly, she retained the essential humanity that had first drawn him to her, the compassion and curiosity that made their shared immortality feel like gift rather than burden. They established themselves in a manor house nestled in mountains where winter lasted 8 months and visitors were rare. Here, surrounded by books and music and the wild beauty of untamed landscapes, they created a life that belonged entirely to them. Damien taught her languages she had never imagined existed, shared with her the accumulated wisdom of ages, showed her how to perceive the hidden currents that connected all living things. In return, she taught him how to laugh again, how to find joy in simple pleasures, how to live in the present moment rather than being haunted by the weight of centuries. Under her influence, he began to compose music again, melodies that capture their shared experiences and dreams of futures yet to unfold. But their peace could not last forever. Word eventually reached them that Lord Thornfield had died under mysterious circumstances, that the political arrangements which had driven them into exile were shifting in ways that might allow their return. More importantly, strange reports were coming from the region around Damien's ancestral lands, crops failing without explanation, livestock sickening, whispers of darkness that moved through the forest like a living thing. "The balance is failing," Damien explained as they stood together on their mountain terrace, watching storm clouds gather over valleys far below. "My absence has created a vacuum that malevolent forces are beginning to exploit. The responsibilities I abandoned when we fled are asserting themselves. Then we return," Serafina said simply. "It will not be safe. Those who opposed our bond have not forgotten or forgiven. And there may be creatures abroad now that even I cannot face alone. Good thing you will not be alone." He turned to study her face, reading in her expression the determination that had first captured his attention in the castle's great hall. "You understand what this means? If we go back, we enter not just political intrigue but supernatural warfare. The enemies we will face are not human, not bound by human limitations or morality. Then we will face them with more than human power." She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm that now matched her own. "We are not the same people who fled in the dawn light years ago. We are stronger now, more connected, capable of things that neither of us could achieve alone. You have no idea what you are proposing." "I have every idea," she replied. I am proposing that we honor the vows we made to each other and the responsibilities that come with the power we now share. I am proposing that we return to finish what we started. The journey home took them through territories that showed clear signs of supernatural interference. Villages where no children played in the streets, forests where even the birds had fallen silent, rivers that ran dark with contamination no natural source could explain. At each stop, Damien's expression grew more grim, his sense of urgency more pronounced. It is worse than I feared, he admitted as they made camp on a hilltop overlooking his ancestral valley. Below them, the castle still stood, but its towers were dark and no smoke rose from its chimneys. Whatever has taken hold here has been growing in strength for months, perhaps years. What kind of creature could do this? The kind that feeds on despair and grows stronger with each life it corrupts. Shadow demons, entities that exist in the spaces between light and darkness. They are drawn to places where the supernatural balance has been disturbed. He paused, studying the darkened landscape below. They are drawn to places like a castle whose guardian abandoned his post. That night, they were attacked. The creatures that emerged from the darkness bore little resemblance to anything from natural world, writhing masses of shadow and hunger that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with intelligence and purpose, focusing their assault on Damien while attempting to separate him from Seraphina. But the bond between them proved stronger than the demons had anticipated. Fighting as one entity with two bodies, they wove patterns of light and motion that turned their attackers' hunger against them. Seraphina discovered powers she had not known she possessed, abilities to channel the life force that flowed between them into weapons of pure energy. When the last demon dissolved back into the shadows from which it had emerged, they stood breathing, heavily but victorious. Well, Damien said, examining a cut on his arm that was already healing, at least we know our bond can withstand supernatural assault. Was there doubt? There is always doubt until theory meets reality. He looked toward the castle with new determination. But now I know we can face whatever waits for us there. The final confrontation came at midnight on the anniversary of their flight. They entered the castle through the same hidden passages they had used to escape, finding corridors thick with unnatural shadows and rooms where the very air seemed poisoned. At the heart of the corruption, in the great hall where they had first met, waited the source of the darkness that had consumed the region. The entity that faced them bore a vague resemblance to human form, but was clearly something far older and more malevolent. It fed on the despair and corruption it had spread, growing stronger with each life it touched. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries of accumulated hatred. The guardian returns, it said, words dripping with mockery, but too late to save what has already been consumed. Your lands are mine now, your people feed my hunger, your legacy crumbles to ash. My legacy, Damien replied, stands beside me. The battle that followed was unlike anything from ordinary human experience. It was fought with forces that reshaped reality itself, with powers that drew on the fundamental energies that bound the world together. The demon commanded armies of shadow and despair, while Damien and Seraphina wielded light and life and the unbreakable connection between them. At the moment when defeat seemed certain, when the creature's power threatened to overwhelm even their combined strength, Seraphina made a choice that changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Instead of fighting the darkness, she embraced it, drawing the creature's corruption into herself and transforming it through the pure love that formed the core of her bond with Damien. The process nearly destroyed her. She felt the demon's hunger and hatred pouring through her like acid, burning away everything she thought she knew about herself. But at the moment when she might have been lost entirely, Damien's love anchored her, providing a lifeline back to who she truly was. When the light faded and the shadows cleared, the great hall was restored to its former glory. The entity that had threatened to consume the region was gone, not destroyed but transformed, its malevolent energy converted into something that could nourish life rather than devour it. And at the center of it all, Seraphina and Damien stood together, forever changed by what they had accomplished. In the days that followed, the land began to heal. Crops grew green again. Livestock returned to health. Children's laughter echoed through villages that had been silent for too long. The people welcomed their lord's return with celebration that lasted for weeks, though they whispered among themselves about the lady who stood always at his side, whose eyes held depths that seemed to reflect starlight. They rebuilt the castle and the life it contained, but everything was different now. The bond between them had been tested by forces that would have destroyed lesser connections, and they had emerged stronger than ever. They ruled together, not as lord and lady but as partners in the truest sense, sharing responsibilities and powers that neither could have managed alone. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the castle settled into peaceful quiet, they would return to the music room where their love had first been acknowledged. There, with violins that sang harmonies impossible for single instruments to achieve, they would play melodies that capture the full complexity of their shared existence, songs of love that had transcended mortality, of choices that had defied ancient laws, of two souls that had found in each other the completion they had never known they were seeking. The music would drift through the castle corridors and out into the night, carrying with it the promise that some bonds are stronger than death, some loves deeper than time, and some stories destined to echo through eternity. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what makes us most human.